My name is Margaret Ellison, and I was 62 years old when this story began to unravel. At that age, you think you've already lived through the major upheavals of life. You believe you've learned enough about people, especially family, to recognize danger long before it knocks on your front door. But betrayal has a way of slipping in through the cracks you never realized you'd left open. For most of my adult life, I lived in a modest yellow house on Sycamore Ridge, a place that had once been my sanctuary. My late husband, Charles, and I bought it when we were in our 30s. We scraped together every cent, working double shifts and clipping coupons like we were training for the Olympics. When he passed away, the mortgage fell entirely on me. I managed, slowly but steadily, until life handed me a different kind of responsibility. My daughter Clara was 35 then, married to a man named Damon. Ambitious, charismatic, but always a little too smooth. They had fallen on hard times after a string of questionable financial choices. One evening, over a dinner of overcooked chicken and strained smiles, they asked if they could move in with me temporarily. I agreed. That word, temporarily, became a kind of ghost that would haunt me later. To make it work, I switched to night shifts at the clinic. The extra hours helped with the rising bills, and I told myself it was worth it to give Clara and Damon some stability. I had no reason to distrust them. Or at least, that's what I wanted to believe. In those first months, everything felt manageable. We had a rhythm, a kind of makeshift routine. I would head out for my shift at dusk, and by the time I returned in the early mornings, the house would be quiet. They handled daytime errands, and Damon had taken charge of mail and paperwork, something I allowed because I was exhausted and he seemed eager to help. But every so often, I'd catch the two of them exchanging glances when I mentioned bills or legal documents. There were whispers in the kitchen that would stop the moment I entered. Small things, subtle things. The kinds of things you dismiss because you love your child and you want to believe in the goodness you raised in them. Still, something in my gut tugged. A feeling that the house I had built over decades was slowly slipping out of my hands without me noticing. I brushed it aside, blaming fatigue or the foggy mind that comes from working nights. I told myself trust was the foundation of family. But trust, when misplaced, becomes a quiet, unassuming trap. And I was walking right into it. By the time I realized what was happening beneath my own roof, the damage had already been done. And the people I had sacrificed the most for were the very ones tightening the noose. That realization would become my undoing, and my awakening. As I would soon discover, betrayal doesn't always arrive with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes it comes softly, disguised as paperwork and polite intentions. And it began on the night I discovered the envelope that would change everything. I found the envelope on a rainy Tuesday morning, one of those mornings where the sky seems to match the heaviness in your bones. I had just returned from a 12-hour shift at the clinic, tired enough that the world felt a little blurry around the edges. I stepped into the kitchen and saw the mail scattered across the counter, a mix of supermarket circulars, bills, and one thick, official-looking envelope with the county recorder's seal. It had my address on it, but not my name. The recipient line read, Clara and Damon Whitaker. No Margaret Ellison. No and family. Just their names. Bold, undeniable. I felt a faint sting in my chest. At first, I thought it must be a mistake. Maybe something they'd applied for, something unrelated to the house. I placed the rest of the mail aside and stared at the envelope, debating whether I was overstepping. But exhaustion tends to erode hesitation, and I knew Damon rarely paid attention to paperwork unless I reminded him. I opened it. What slid out onto the counter made my breath catch, a stamped and recorded deed, my house deed. Except my name was nowhere on it. I scanned the document once, then twice, each time feeling my pulse hammer harder. It listed only two owners. Clara Whitaker, my daughter. Damon Whitaker, my son-in-law. My name, the woman who had bought the house, lived in it for 3 decades, and paid the mortgage even as I worked night after night, had been erased. I must have stood there for several minutes, gripping the edges of the counter to keep myself from swaying. The kitchen felt foreign, like I had stepped into someone else's home. A sickening realization settled into my gut. This wasn't an accident. Someone had removed my name from the deed. I rushed to my bedroom, dug through the file cabinet where I kept the original deed, and pulled it out. My name was right there, clear as day. I hadn't been imagining things. How had they done it? Why would they do it? The questions tangled in my mind like briars. When Clara finally woke up, I stood in the hallway waiting. I didn't yell. My voice, when I finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. "What is this?" I held out the deed. Her eyes widened, not with guilt, but with irritation. "Mom, why are you going through our mail?" "I'm going through my house deed," I replied. Damon emerged behind her, rubbing his eyes. "Margaret, we talked about refinancing months ago." "No," I said slowly. "We didn't." Clara crossed her arms. "You must have forgotten. You're working nights. You get confused sometimes." The words hit me like a slap. I felt myself shrinking, but only for a moment. "My signature isn't on this document," I said, holding it up. Damon sighed deeply, as if I were being unreasonable. "We handled it. You told us to take care of the paperwork." I hadn't. I knew I hadn't. And their calmness, the confidence in their lie, terrified me in a way I had never felt before. I realized then that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a clerical error. This was orchestrated, calculated. And I had just walked into the opening act of their plan. What they didn't know was that they had awakened something in me that exhaustion had kept dormant for too long. A sharper version of myself. A woman who would not go quietly. To understand why this betrayal cut as deeply as it did, you would need to know a little about our past. About Clara, about me, and about the quiet fractures that had formed between us long before the deed ever changed hands. Clara was my only child. After Charles passed, the two of us clung to one another through our grief. I believed I had raised her with compassion and stability, even if life hadn't always been gentle. But somewhere in her 20s, a distance grew between us. She became increasingly drawn to people who valued shortcuts over substance. Damon was the most magnetic of them all. He had a way of making promises sound like destiny. Plans sounded effortless when he described them. He spun tales of success that never seemed to materialize, yet Clara believed in him with a devotion that often left her blind. I saw warning signs early on: financial irresponsibility, manipulation coded in flattery. But a mother's instinct clashes with a mother's hope. And hope is a stubborn thing. When they moved in with me, I told myself it was temporary. Just long enough for them to regroup. I didn't want to judge them. I didn't want to interfere. I wanted to trust that the daughter I had raised would never take advantage of me. But I also knew the subtle ways guilt had shaped her. She had carried the weight of my widowhood as if she had caused it. And Damon had fed into that narrative, painting me as someone fragile, someone who needed help, someone they were, in his words, supporting emotionally. I didn't realize then how quickly a narrative like that could become a weapon. Looking back, the clues were there. Damon with his too confident attitude when handling paperwork. Clara insisting that I didn't need to worry about things at my age. The gradual way they began treating the house as theirs. Even moving furniture without asking. Buying decor and saying things like, "We want it to feel like our space too." I chalked it up to generational differences. I told myself I was being overly sensitive. But beneath those everyday justifications were deeper motives. Ones I would later uncover with painful clarity. In the months leading up to the deed transfer, Damon had lost his job again. Clara's hours had been cut. Their debts were piling up. They saw my home, my mortgage, paid through my labor, as a life raft. And instead of asking, instead of having an honest conversation, they decided to take control of the raft entirely. Maybe they convinced themselves they were entitled to it. Maybe they thought I'd simply accept it. Maybe they believed love equaled obedience. They had forgotten that I had lived a life before they were even born. That I had survived more loss and hardship than they could fathom. That beneath the gentle exterior of a 62-year-old woman was a spine reinforced by decades of standing back up after life had knocked me down. Their betrayal didn't break me. It woke me. As their voices faded into the background that morning, Clara insisting I had approved something I knew I hadn't, I made a vow to myself. I wouldn't accuse without proof. I wouldn't confront without preparation. I wouldn't let desperation make me sloppy. I would step quietly. I would observe. I would gather every fact, every date, every inconsistency. And when the time came, I would pull the thread that unraveled it all. They thought removing me from the deed was the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The very next day, I began my investigation. Not with anger, but with precision. I learned long ago that when people lie, they depend on your emotional reaction to cloud your thinking. What they never expect is calm, methodical silence. My first stop was the county recorder's office. I didn't announce myself. I didn't mention the confrontation. I simply requested a copy of the transaction history connected to my property. The clerk, a young man who looked like he still believed the world was a fair place, printed the documents without a second thought. When he handed them to me, I thanked him and stepped outside to sit on a bench. I studied the deed transfer, the signatures, the notary stamp, the date. The notary signature wasn't mine. The handwriting didn't remotely resemble mine. And the date. The date was a night I had been at work from 6 p.m. to 7 a.m., logged in at the clinic's biometric time clock. In other words, it was impossible that I had signed anything. Forged signatures. Fraudulent notarization. Illegal transfer of property. My hands were steady as I photographed every page. Next, I requested security footage timestamps from the clinic, confirming my shift hours on the night in question. I collected pay stubs, time logs, and digital clock-in data. Then I contacted the notary listed on the document. I approached her gently, politely. She sounded confused at first, then horrified. "I've never met you," she said. "I notarize dozens of signatures a week, but I always check ID. If I didn't meet you, then someone used my stamp fraudulently." Her voice trembled as she added, "I may need to report this." "You will," I assured her. "But not yet. I need all the evidence lined up." Over the next week, I gathered everything. Bank statements showing I had been paying the mortgage even after they removed my name. Property tax receipts sent in my name, proof that my income alone had kept the house afloat. Meanwhile, at home, I said nothing. Clara seemed relieved by my silence. Damon, however, watched me carefully. I caught him observing me over the rim of his coffee mug, his eyes calculating. He could sense something shifting. Not enough to call me out, but enough to make him wary. Good. Every night before my shift, I scanned the house for documents they might be hiding. Every morning, I noted changes, locked drawers, missing papers, whispered phone calls. I traced the forged deed back to a signing appointment that never occurred but had been witnessed by someone whose name rang a faint bell. After digging online, I discovered the witness was a friend of Damon's, a former co-worker he once described as someone who could make things happen for the right price. Piece by piece, their scheme unfolded before me. They had removed me from the deed, forged my signature, used a fraudulent witness, filed falsified paperwork with the county, and they had done it while I worked nights to pay for the very home they were stealing. But gathering evidence wasn't enough. I needed the perfect moment to reveal the truth, a moment where their lies would collapse under the weight of undeniable facts. That moment came sooner than expected. Because Damon made a mistake. He scheduled a private meeting with a realtor. A meeting I had every intention of attending, uninvited. The following Thursday, the house felt unusually tense. Clara was overly cheerful, humming in the kitchen as if rehearsing happiness. Damon moved restlessly from room to room, dressed too formally for a day he claimed he'd be working from home. I watched from the hallway as he checked the time on his watch. Clara squeezed his arm, whispering, "This is the right move." He nodded, although uncertainty flickered across his face. At 11:15 a.m., they left the house. I gave them a 10-minute head start before driving to the address I found scribbled in Damon's planner. A realty office on Willow Creek Road. The office building was glass-fronted, with open blinds and a clear view inside. I parked across the street, taking a moment to steady my breathing. Through the window, I saw them seated with a realtor, a polished woman in a burgundy dress, flipping through a folder of listing estimates. I walked toward the building. Each step felt like a reclaiming. When I entered, the receptionist looked up. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said calmly, "but those two do." I gestured toward the meeting room. "And this concerns me directly." Before she could protest, the realtor noticed me through the glass and raised a polite hand. Clara's face paled. Damon's jaw tightened. I opened the door and stepped inside. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Clara asked, her voice too high, too rehearsed. "I'm here," I said, placing my folder on the table, "because you're attempting to sell my house." The realtor blinked. "Your house?" they said. "What did they say?" I asked, turning to her with quiet curiosity. "That they were the sole owners. That the mortgage and deed were entirely in their names." I nodded slowly. "Well, that's interesting. Because what they've shown you is the result of fraud." Damon leaned forward. "Margaret, you're confused." I raised a hand, stopping him mid-lie. "No. I'm prepared." I opened my folder. First, I laid out the original deed with my name on it. Then the forged deed removing me. Then the time logs, the notarization statement, the witness background, photographs of signatures side by side. The realtor's expression shifted from polite interest to professional alarm. Clara's face went blotchy. "Mom, you're making this bigger than it needs to be." "Bigger?" I repeated softly. "You forged my signature. You falsified a legal record. You attempted to steal my home and sell it while I paid the mortgage working nights." Damon swallowed hard. "We were trying to protect the house. By removing the person who owns it." I asked. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. I slid the evidence toward the realtor. "Please note that anyone attempting to list or sell this property using fraudulent documents will be implicated. I suggest you withdraw immediately." She didn't hesitate. She closed the folder, stood and said, "This meeting is over. I'll be reporting the attempted fraudulent listing to my legal department." She left the room. Silence settled like ash. Clara's voice cracked. "Mom, we can talk about this. Please." But I wasn't finished. I leaned back, calm and composed. "You made choices. Now the truth is out. And we're far from done." Their plan had unraveled. But the consequences were only beginning. When we returned home, the facade could no longer hold. Clara paced the living room like a trapped animal, her hands shaking. Damon retreated to the kitchen, pretending to busy himself with nothing at all. I stood in the doorway, watching them unravel. I wasn't angry. I wasn't shouting. I was done with the emotional contortions that had held me hostage for too long. Calmly, I placed the folder of evidence on the coffee table. "Sit," I said softly. They both hesitated, but something in my tone left no room for negotiation. Clara sat first. Damon followed. I took a breath. "You forged my signature. That is a felony. You falsified notarization. Another felony. You attempted to transfer my property without consent. Illegal. You then attempted to sell it. Also illegal." Clara covered her face with trembling hands. "Mom, we were desperate. We thought we could refinance and lower the payments. You're getting older. You work too much. We thought." "You thought," I cut in, "that stealing from me would solve your problems." Damon crossed his arms, trying to regain control. "We were repaying you by taking responsibility. You don't need this house at your age." I turned my gaze to him, steady and unblinking. Do not mistake my age for weakness. He faltered. I continued. I've already contacted an attorney. I've already documented everything. And I've already spoken with the notary whose stamp you forged. Clara gasped. Mom, please, don't press charges. We didn't mean. Intent, I said, doesn't erase actions. Silence again. Then I laid out their options. 1. You leave this house within 30 days. Peacefully. No arguments. You sign a written agreement acknowledging your wrongdoing and relinquishing any claim to the property. I won't pursue criminal charges. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Mom. 2, I continued. I turn all of this over to the district attorney. Forgery, fraud, perjury, theft, and attempted real estate fraud. Damon shot to his feet. You wouldn't. Your family. I looked up at him. Family doesn't steal their mother's home. He froze. Clara's sobs filled the room. Damon stood rigid, jaw clenched, powerless. I waited. Finally, Clara whispered, We'll leave. Damon opened his mouth to argue, but Clara grabbed his arm. We have no choice, she said. I nodded once. Then we'll do this properly. That afternoon, I drafted the agreement with my attorney. They signed it, hands shaking. The confrontation was over. But the consequences were only beginning to unfold. The next month unfolded with a quiet gravity. Clara and Damon packed their belongings into cardboard boxes, avoiding eye contact, their presence in the house shrinking little by little each day. It was strange, watching them go through this process. I felt grief, yes, but also an undeniable sense of justice. I was not cruel. I didn't throw their things on the lawn or relish their fear. But I didn't soften the reality for them either. Choices have consequences. And part of maturity, something they hadn't yet learned, is accepting those consequences without deflecting blame. Word must have spread through Damon's circles, because within weeks he lost a freelance contract he'd been counting on. The notary pressed formal charges for misuse of her credentials. While I agreed not to involve the district attorney, her own professional protection required she file a report. Clara, caught between loyalty and shame, tried to shield him. But every attempt unraveled in the face of documented evidence. Meanwhile, I filed to restore the deed to its original, legal form. My attorney handled everything with meticulous efficiency. By mid-month, my name stood alone on the deed once more. One morning, as I was watering the front garden, Clara approached me. She stood on the walkway, a small box in her hands. Photos, trinkets, childhood mementos I had saved. She looked younger than her 35 years in that moment. Smaller. Mom, she said softly, I never meant to hurt you. I put the watering can down. Then why did you? She looked at the ground. I trusted him more than I trusted myself. He told me we were helping you. He said you'd be safer if the house was in our names. I thought I was doing the right thing. And when you saw the forged signature? I asked. She winced. I didn't want to see it. I nodded. That's the danger of blind trust, Clara. It makes you complicit. She wiped her eyes. I'm sorry, Mom. I really am. I believed her. But forgiveness does not erase accountability. It simply opens a door for someone to walk through, if they choose to. When moving day arrived, Damon avoided me entirely. Clara hugged me long and trembling before they drove away. The house felt quiet, heavy, but also mine again. I changed the locks. I updated the security system. I restored my routines. Slowly, peace returned. Justice had been served. Not through revenge, not through rage, but through truth, documentation, and unwavering resolve. What they tried to take from me, I reclaimed. And in the silence that followed, I found something even more valuable. Myself. In the weeks that followed their departure, the house settled into a familiar stillness. A stillness I had not realized I had missed. I returned to my garden, to my books, to my morning tea on the porch. I resumed day shifts at the clinic. Life, in its quiet simplicity, began to feel like mine again. But there were moments, small, piercing moments, when the betrayal would echo back. A glance at the empty guest room. A quiet creak on the staircase. A memory of Clara as a little girl, her hand in mine. Healing is rarely linear. But with every sunrise, I gained a little more clarity. People often think betrayal is about the moment of discovery, the shock, the confrontation. But for me, the deeper wound came from the realization that love does not always protect us from harm. Sometimes it blinds us to it. And yet, I don't regret loving my daughter. I don't regret helping her when she needed stability. What I regret is the silence I kept for too long, the times I noticed small red flags and convinced myself they meant nothing. I learned that protecting your peace is not selfish. Boundaries do not make you unkind. And age does not make you fragile. If anything, age sharpens your ability to see through the fog of other people's intentions. I also learned that justice, when pursued with patience and truth, can be powerful without cruelty. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to destroy them. I simply needed to reveal the truth. And truth, once revealed, carried its own consequences. As for Clara, she reached out again months later. Carefully. Apologetically. Not asking for money or help. Just asking for a chance to rebuild trust. I didn't open the door entirely, but I cracked it. Healing, after all, is a mutual effort. Damon, from what I hear, moved out of state. Last I knew, he was facing ongoing legal issues related to the forged notarization. His choices caught up with him, not by my hand, but by the natural weight of his own actions. And me. I remain in the yellow house on Sycamore Ridge. The home I built. The home I paid for. The home I defended, not with rage, but with truth. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Never underestimate the quiet strength of someone who has lived through hardship. Never dismiss the instincts that whisper when something feels wrong. And never allow love to convince you to surrender what you have earned through a lifetime of sacrifice. Justice does not always roar. Sometimes it speaks calmly, with documents and dates and undeniable facts. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Has someone ever tried to take advantage of your kindness? How did you reclaim your power? Your stories matter too.